Avoidants almost never cross this particular line with an empath, unless what they feel is real. Picture finding out that the clearest evidence of love isn't a big declaration, isn't non-stop texting, and isn't even hearing the words, "I love you." Picture realizing that for certain people, the truest sign of love is stepping over a boundary they've spent their whole life defending. A boundary so private, so heavily fortified, that almost no one is ever let past it. If you've ever loved someone avoidant, you've probably wrestled with a painful question. Do they actually love me, or am I just one more person standing outside walls they refuse to lower? The truth is messier than most people expect, because avoidants don't measure love the way everyone else does. They don't show their feelings through big romantic gestures or hours of emotional conversation. Their deepest feelings usually hide underneath distance, quiet, and self-protection. But there's one boundary they rarely ever cross, unless their feelings are genuine. And once you understand what that boundary actually is, a lot of their confusing behavior starts making sense. Stick around, because this might change how you see avoidant attachment and love altogether. And if this kind of insight into avoidant psychology interests you, subscribe to Avoidant Decoded so you don't miss the video that finally makes it all click. To understand why this boundary matters so much, you need to understand how an avoidant actually experiences the world. Most people assume avoidants pull away because they don't care enough. In truth, many pull away because caring feels unsafe. Long before any relationship starts, they've usually built a deep belief that leaning on someone else invites danger. Through hard experiences, disappointment, inconsistency, or simply learning early to rely only on themselves, they've become skilled at guarding their independence. Their inner world becomes sacred territory, the one place they feel safe and in control, where nobody can blindside them emotionally. That's why avoidants often seem so comfortable handling life solo. They take pride in self-reliance, rarely ask for help, and convince themselves they don't need what most people naturally want. From the outside, it can look like confidence, and sometimes it is. But underneath that independence often sits a quiet fear that getting close to someone means losing the very thing that keeps them feeling secure. Every relationship creates an invisible push and pull. Part of them wants connection. Another part fears what that connection might eventually cost. That tug of war sits at the heart of almost every avoidant relationship. This is exactly where empaths come into the story. There's something oddly magnetic about avoidants and empaths together. On the surface, they look like opposites. Empaths lean into emotion, avoidants lean away from it. Empaths crave closeness and depth. Avoidants seem guarded and hard to reach. Yet that contrast often sparks real attraction. Avoidants are drawn to the warmth empaths offer, the patience, the way they hold space for feelings without judgment. Empaths give avoidants something they secretly want, but rarely ask for: a feeling of emotional safety. Meanwhile, empaths are pulled toward the mystery of the avoidant, sensing hidden depth behind the walls, suspecting there's more beneath the surface than the avoidant lets show. Both people end up deeply invested, just for different reasons, and that creates real tension. The empath wants more openness. The avoidant wants the connection, but fears losing control over it. The closer they get, the tighter that tension pulls, until eventually the avoidant faces a moment where they have to decide if the connection is worth the risk. Here's what most people miss. Avoidants usually fear losing control more than they fear being rejected. Rejection stings, but dependence feels even scarier. The thought that someone else's actions could shape their emotional state feels deeply unsettling. They might enjoy someone's company, think about them constantly, care more than they'd ever admit out loud. But the moment they notice themselves growing dependent, internal alarms start going off. Suddenly they want space. Suddenly they're harder to read. Suddenly they pull back even while their feelings are actually deepening. This is one of the most misunderstood parts of avoidant psychology. People read withdrawal as disinterest, when often it's the complete opposite. The stronger the feelings grow, the more exposed they feel, and the more exposed they feel, the harder they fight to protect themselves. It becomes a frustrating loop where love and fear compete for the upper hand, one pulling toward closeness, the other toward safety, leaving both people confused until one side finally wins out. Underneath all of it sits the invisible wall every avoidant keeps standing. It isn't built from coldness or arrogance, it's built from protection, separating what they're willing to share from what they keep hidden from nearly everyone. Most people only ever meet the outer edge of that wall. They get affection, attention, companionship, but never real access to what's happening underneath. That's why liking someone and trusting someone are two entirely different things for an avoidant. They can truly enjoy a person's presence without giving that person real influence over their inner world. They can care deeply while keeping firm emotional boundaries, staying present while still keeping one foot near the door. The wall stays standing because it protects their sense of control, but every once in a while, someone shows up who shifts everything. Someone who consistently feels safe, who doesn't push for vulnerability but earns it quietly, whose presence starts mattering more than the avoidant ever planned. And that's when the wall finally starts to crack. It doesn't happen all at once or dramatically, but gradually enough that even the avoidant might not notice it occurring, because the boundary they swore they'd never cross slowly comes into view. And crossing it reveals whether what they feel is just attachment or something far more real. This is where things get interesting, because once an empath gets too close, something fairly predictable tends to happen inside an avoidant. At first, everything seems to be heading somewhere good. The conversations deepen, the connection feels stronger, trust seems to be building. Then, almost out of nowhere, the avoidant starts pulling away. They text less, seem distracted, create distance where closeness used to be. For the empath, this shift can feel devastating, since it seems to undo everything that came before. Right when the connection started feeling real, it suddenly feels at risk. But what's actually happening underneath rarely matches what it looks like on the surface. The avoidant usually isn't running from the empath. They're running from what the relationship is starting to stir up inside them. The closer the empath gets, the harder it becomes for the avoidant to keep pretending they're unaffected. The emotional investment becomes too obvious to deny. The relationship starts taking up more space in their mind. Losing it becomes a real possibility, and so does needing someone. And for a person who spent years telling themselves self-reliance is the only safe way to live, that realization can feel like too much. So they try to steady themselves by pulling back, not because the connection means nothing, but because it suddenly means far too much. This is one of the paradoxes most people never figure out, that an avoidance retreat is usually a response to growing significance, not fading interest. But if the bond keeps deepening, eventually a moment arrives that separates simple attachment from real love. This is the boundary hinted at from the start, the one avoidants almost never cross unless their feelings run deep. It's the moment they start letting another person's presence shape their own decisions. To most people, that sounds completely normal, since considering someone else's feelings is just part of a healthy relationship. But for an avoidant, it's a massive psychological shift. Independence isn't just a preference for them, it's a protective framework built around their entire identity. Their choices are usually driven by their own needs, goals, and comfort, and they guard their freedom instinctively because freedom feels like safety. Yet when love becomes genuine, something shifts. They start asking questions they normally wouldn't bother with. How will this affect them? What would make them feel secure? What choice supports the relationship instead of just supporting me? These questions might sound small, but for an avoidant, they mark the slow surrender of emotional isolation. They're no longer acting as if they exist completely on their own. Someone else's happiness starts to actually matter. Someone else's pain becomes hard to ignore. And most importantly, they start accepting that the relationship deserves a seat at the table next to their own needs. None of this is forced or done out of obligation. It happens because that person has become emotionally significant enough to get past walls that once seemed unbreakable. What makes this shift so meaningful is that it usually shows up in small moments, long before it shows up in big ones. An avoidant who genuinely loves someone probably won't suddenly turn into an open book overnight, won't deliver some grand emotional speech revealing everything they've been holding back. Instead, the love tends to surface through quiet changes in behavior. They start adjusting their plans around someone else. They remember the small details that matter. They pay closer attention to how the other person is feeling. They start caring about outcomes that wouldn't have registered before. For maybe the first time in years, someone else's emotional experience starts shaping their own choices. This is the boundary they rarely cross, because it asks for a kind of vulnerability that goes deeper than just saying the right words. It means admitting that someone else's presence has become important enough to change how they move through life. And for someone who spent years protecting their independence, that's a massive deal. It's one of the clearest indicators that what they feel goes beyond attraction or comfort or convenience, that it's genuine emotional investment. This distinction matters even more once you separate attachment from real love. A lot of people assume strong attachment automatically means love, but they're not always the same thing. Avoidants can become attached while still keeping their truest self locked away. They can enjoy someone's company, settle into familiar routines, and appreciate having that person around, all without ever fully lowering their guard. Attachment can exist comfortably inside the boundaries they've already set. Love asks for something bigger. It demands trust, emotional risk, letting another person's well-being matter in ways that leave you exposed. An avoidant might stay attached to someone simply because the relationship feels easy and familiar. But when they start making decisions that put the connection first, when they begin weighing someone else's emotional reality alongside their own, when they choose to expose themselves to the uncertainty that comes with caring deeply, attachment starts turning into something far more meaningful. That's why some avoidants can stay in relationships for years without ever truly crossing that internal line. They might care, they might value what they have, but real love only begins once self-protection stops running every decision, once the connection becomes worth the risk. And maybe the most beautiful part of all this is that the signs usually show up long before the avoidant ever puts any of it into words. You start noticing small shifts in consistency. The disappearing acts happen less often. The walls don't feel quite as high. There's less rush to escape the moment intimacy deepens. Conversations start reaching places that used to be completely off-limits. Instead of retreating the second things get emotionally uncomfortable, they stay present a little longer, listen more closely, share more openly, and let themselves be seen in ways that once felt impossible. To anyone watching from outside, these shifts might look minor, but internally, they're enormous victories. Every consistent moment is a challenge to old fears. Every act of openness is a step past familiar defenses. Every decision that puts connection ahead of self-protection reflects a quiet internal battle being won. This is exactly why understanding avoidance means looking past surface behavior, because their most meaningful expressions of love are usually the quiet ones. They show up in the slow lowering of defenses, the growing willingness to stay emotionally present, and the gradual acceptance that someone else has become important enough to shape their world. And as those walls keep softening, something even bigger starts happening. The avoidant begins opening the one door they've spent their whole life guarding, the door to their inner world. And once that door starts opening, everything shifts. The moment an avoidant starts sharing their inner world, the relationship reaches territory almost nobody else gets to see. Most avoidants spend years carefully curating what people are allowed to see. They'll share opinions, experiences, jokes, even certain personal stories, but deeper layers stay hidden from nearly everyone. These are the fears they almost never admit to, the disappointments they're still carrying, the moments that quietly shaped how they view relationships, and the vulnerabilities they've trained themselves to keep locked away. What matters here is that avoidants don't guard these parts of themselves because they like secrecy. They guard them because being exposed feels dangerous. At some point, they learned that being vulnerable could lead to pain, judgment, disappointment, or losing control. So when they start revealing pieces of that inner world, they're not just sharing information, they're taking a real risk. They're letting someone witness parts of themselves that can't be hidden again once they've been seen. That's why it's rarely casual when an avoidant opens up. It tends to happen slowly, almost by accident at first, a conversation that goes deeper than usual, a confession that slips out unintentionally, a memory they haven't mentioned in years. To an empath, these moments might feel ordinary, but to the avoidant, they can feel huge. Every bit of honesty carries a quiet fear about what the other person will do with that trust. And when they keep opening up anyway, despite that fear, it's telling you something important. That the relationship has become more valuable to them than staying completely emotionally hidden. Ironically, this is also where a lot of empaths miss what's actually happening, because empaths often gauge progress by emotional intensity, and that makes them overlook quieter transformation. They might be hoping for big declarations, obvious vulnerability, or clear verbal reassurance. And when those don't show up fast enough, they assume nothing has really changed. Meanwhile, the avoidant could be making huge emotional progress that's going completely unnoticed. The avoidant who used to disappear during hard conversations now sticks around. The one who used to keep every struggle private is now sharing pieces of their inner experience. The one who once prioritized distance above everything is starting to let real closeness in. But because these shifts aren't dramatic, they're easy to misread. This creates one of the most painful gaps between avoidants and empaths. The empath feels unseen because they're waiting for bigger gestures of love. The avoidant feels unseen because their quiet efforts go unacknowledged. Neither one fully speaks the other's emotional language. The truth is that avoidants tend to express affection through changed behavior rather than changed words. Their love shows up through consistency, trust, presence, and the willingness to stay engaged even when every instinct says to run. These signals are easy to miss if you're only watching for the conventional signs of intimacy. As the relationship deepens further, another shift starts to appear. The avoidant begins making sacrifices they'd normally never make. That doesn't mean losing their identity or turning into a different person overnight. It means loosening the rigid, self-protective habits that used to run every decision. For years, protecting their emotional safety may have ranked above everything else. Comfort came first, distance came first, independence came first. But real love starts rearranging those priorities. The avoidant starts tolerating discomfort for the sake of the relationship. They have conversations they'd usually dodge. They stay emotionally present during moments that make them uneasy. They become willing to work through conflict instead of fleeing it. These compromises might look small from outside, but internally they represent massive change. Every one of them chips away at a long-held belief that vulnerability must always be avoided, and every effort to stay connected through uncomfortable moments weakens the grip of old defenses. This is why real love tends to transform avoidance in ways you can't measure through grand gestures. It happens quietly, through repeated choices to lean into connection, even when self-protection would be the easier path. One of the clearest signs of this transformation shows up when they stop planning only for themselves. For most of their lives, avoidants get used to moving through the world as independent units, with plans, goals, routines, and decisions structured entirely around personal autonomy. They protect their flexibility instinctively, because flexibility protects their freedom. But once someone becomes deeply important to them, something changes. Future decisions start including that other person almost automatically. The avoidant starts thinking about how upcoming choices will affect the relationship. They picture shared experiences instead of only individual ones. They start imagining a future that includes someone else standing right there beside them. This shift matters enormously because planning a future together requires trust. It requires believing the relationship deserves a place in their long-term vision. A lot of avoidants resist this kind of integration because it opens them up to real vulnerability. Since the more someone becomes woven into the future, the more painful losing them would be. But when love is real, avoiding that risk gets harder and harder. The avoidant slowly starts making room for someone else in spaces that used to belong only to them. What used to be my future quietly starts becoming our future, even if they never actually say those words out loud. And maybe this leads to one of the most misunderstood parts of avoidant devotion. Their deepest acts of love often hide inside completely ordinary moments. Pop culture conditions people to look for dramatic romance, passionate speeches, and loud, visible affection. Avoidants tend to express devotion in totally different ways. They show up when it counts. They remember the small details. They become someone you can rely on. They quietly fix problems. They create stability. They protect the connection through actions so simple they often go unnoticed, yet those actions carry real emotional weight. For an avoidant, reliability isn't just a habit, it's an expression of commitment. Consistency isn't just convenience, it's a quiet declaration that someone matters enough to stick around for. That's why understanding avoidant love means paying closer attention to what they repeatedly do rather than what they repeatedly say. Their devotion lives in patterns, not promises. It shows up through effort, not performance. And as their feelings deepen, these small, quiet gestures pile up until a much bigger picture starts to form, one that reveals something remarkable. The avoidant, who once seemed completely out of reach, isn't just protecting themselves from connection anymore. They're actively choosing connection, despite the fears still sitting underneath. But behind all this change, a hidden struggle keeps playing out, a private tug-of-war between longing and fear that almost nobody else ever witnesses. And understanding that struggle might be the key to understanding everything that follows. What looks like an avoidance journey from outside hides an internal war. Love doesn't erase their fear, it intensifies the pull between wanting closeness and needing protection. They lean in, then retreat. They open up, then go quiet. Not contradiction, just two real needs fighting for control. Certain empaths matter because they offer acceptance without pressure, patience without losing themselves, understanding instead of judgment. For someone used to feeling misread, that safety leaves a lasting mark. Eventually comes the point of no return. The relationship becomes something they can't imagine losing. The illusion of easy independence breaks. This person's happiness, absence, and pain now matter. Beautiful and terrifying at once. The real sign of avoidant love isn't grand gestures. It's crossing the line of total self-protection. Letting someone's presence change them. Choosing connection despite every instinct to stay guarded. Their love is quiet, consistency over intensity, presence over performance. When they finally let someone in, they're rewriting rules they've lived by for years. And that may be the deepest love they're capable of showing.